Stephanie Williams was never one to fall for fairytale romance. As a successful CEO of her own company, she had built her empire from the ground up, relying on wit and cunning rather than love. So when Greg Well, a charming, mysterious man with a hidden agenda, entered her life, she saw him as just another business associate. But Greg had different plans. His allure was undeniable, and despite her initial reservations, Stephanie found herself drawn to him. One night, Greg invited her to his ancestral palace in a remote village to celebrate their blossoming relationship. The invitation, though tempting, felt strangely urgent. She tried to dismiss the feeling of unease growing within her. What harm could a weekend at a grand palace possibly do? Upon arrival, Stephanie was awestruck by the grandeur of Greg's family palace, which seemed to stand at the edge of the world. The towering spires, ancient stone walls, and sprawling grounds seemed both magnificent and foreboding. Greg led her through the halls, showing her portraits of his ancestors, kings and queens who once ruled over the land with absolute power. But as the evening wore on, Stephanie began to notice unsettling things. The guards' stern faces, the whispers behind closed doors, and the strange rituals she overheard the servants discussing. Something was wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. That night, as she lay in her luxurious guest room, the door creaked open. A strange, shadowy figure entered, an elderly woman, with pale eyes that seemed to look straight through her. The woman whispered, "You are the chosen one, but not for love, Stephanie. You are the chosen for a sacrifice. Beware of Greg's intentions." Before Stephanie could react, the woman vanished into the shadows. The following morning, Stephanie tried to dismiss the strange encounter. Perhaps it was a dream, or perhaps the isolation of the palace was playing tricks on her mind. But the more she thought about it, the more the woman's words echoed in her mind. Something was wrong with Greg's family, and it wasn't just his wealth and charm. Greg, sensing her discomfort, took her aside. He promised that nothing would harm her. But his eyes, dark and intense, hinted at something more. "I will protect you," he whispered, his words heavy with a hidden meaning. But as they spoke, a scream echoed through the palace. Guards rushed down the halls, and the tension in the air thickened. A maid had been found dead in the courtyard, her throat slashed. The palace was on edge, and Stephanie couldn't shake the feeling that her life was now intertwined with something darker than she could comprehend. As the evening drew closer, Stephanie was summoned to the grand dining hall. Greg had prepared a special dinner in her honor. She walked into the room, where a long table was set with silver dishes, and Greg sat at the head, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. But as the evening wore on, Stephanie began to feel the weight of eyes upon her. The servants and guards were watching her closely, their expressions cold and unreadable. It wasn't just the dinner that unnerved her, it was the way Greg looked at her. She could see the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that consumed his family for generations. Just as she tried to steady her nerves, a sudden crash rang out from the far end of the hall. Guards burst in, dragging Pascal, her loyal bodyguard, into the room. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, and he was covered in blood. "Stephanie, I tried to stop them, they know too much," Pascal gasped, barely able to stand. Greg's expression turned cold as he stood. "I warned you to stay out of this, Pascal. But now you've crossed the line." The room fell silent as Greg's guards closed in on Pascal. Stephanie rushed to his side, but it was too late. Pascal was dragged away, and Stephanie was left in shock. What was happening? Why had Greg turned so cruel? The next day, as Stephanie wandered the palace in search of answers, she found herself back in the same room where the elderly woman had appeared to her. This time, there were no shadows, no whispers. But the woman's voice returned in her mind, clearer than before. "You must know the truth, Stephanie. The Well family is cursed. Greg is not the man you think he is. His power, his immortality, it's all tied to blood. The sacrifice of the bride is not just tradition, it's the only way for him to live forever." Stephanie's heart raced as she pieced together the fragments of her encounter. The woman was right. Greg's charm, his obsession with her, the strange rituals, all of it pointed to one horrifying truth: Greg needed her blood for a dark ritual. As night fell, Stephanie's worst fears came to life. She was dressed in an elaborate gown, prepared to walk down the aisle to Greg, her captor, her would-be executioner. The grand hall was filled with guests, some familiar faces, others strange and foreign. They all gathered to witness the marriage between Greg and his bride, unaware of the deadly ritual that was about to unfold. But before the ceremony could begin, a voice rang out from the crowd. It was Greg's brother, Theophilus, who had always been in the shadows, quietly watching from the sidelines. "Stop. You can't marry her," Theophilus shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. Greg's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Theophilus stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "She's broken the rules. The sacrifice must remain pure. You cannot marry her. She is not meant for you." Greg's anger fled. "What nonsense is this, brother?" But the room was filled with gasps as Theophilus revealed the truth that the gods had seen Stephanie's nakedness, an abomination in the eyes of the gods. Only Greg was allowed to see her in such a state, but now the ritual was tainted, and the gods would not accept it. Greg's rage boiled over, but before he could react, something unexpected happened. A loud clap of thunder filled the air, and the lights flickered. Suddenly, a figure appeared, an ancient sorcerer, his face hidden behind a cloak of shadows. "The ritual has already been compromised," the sorcerer intoned. "The gods will not be pleased. The curse has already begun." As the sorcerer's words sank in, Theophilus seized the moment. "I will take what is mine," he declared, drawing a dagger from his robes. "You've ruled for too long, Greg. It's time for a new king." Theophilus lunged at Greg, and a fierce battle ensued. Guards rushed in, and chaos erupted in the hall. Blood was spilled, and in the midst of the chaos, Greg's brother, driven by greed and jealousy, struck the final blow, killing Greg in cold blood. The room fell silent as Greg's body crumpled to the floor. Theophilus stood over him, panting with fury. "At last, I am free." But the moment of triumph was short-lived. As the full moon rose outside, Greg's spirit returned, a furious force of darkness. Theophilus screamed as he was dragged to the ground, his body contorting as the vengeful spirit choked him. "You wanted my throne," Greg's ghost whispered, his voice cold and vengeful. "Now you will pay the price." With Greg's death, the palace was thrown into turmoil. The sorcerer, realizing the consequences of his actions, vanished into the shadows. Theophilus lay dead, and the chiefs were left with no leader. In the confusion, Stephanie and Pascal, though weak and battered, made their escape. Together, they fled the palace, leaving behind the ghost of the past and the ruins of a cursed dynasty. As they crossed the border into the city, Stephanie glanced back once, but the palace was no more. Its power was broken. Pascal, still recovering from his wounds, smiled faintly. "You're free now, Stephanie." Stephanie took a deep breath, the weight of the past few days finally lifting. "We are both free." The two of them walked into the dawn, their futures uncertain but their spirits unbroken. And as they left the cursed land behind, the echoes of the World Dynasty faded into the shadows, never to rise again. Months later, Stephanie returned to her city, where she resumed her life. But she could never forget the palace, the twisted rituals, and the betrayal she'd witnessed. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would hear Greg's voice whisper on the wind, a reminder that even in death, some spirits never rest.